Yep, green's on the top.
Great.
And
Okay.
then you're live now, so you want to make sure that's on red so they won't hear you. So just
Do you want to call? There we go. You're good.
We're good?
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Anna Grzmabusa. I'm the director of Europe Center, and next to me is Catherine Stoner, director of the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. And welcome to another meeting in our joint Rethinking European Development and Security speaker series. Today, we're delighted to welcome Steve Fish, who is a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and a very prominent scholar and analyst of Russia, democratic erosion, and the rising challenges to democracy across the world. He is the author of 3 books and co-author of 3 more on topics ranging from Muslims and public opinion to parliaments to the failures of Russia's democracy. He's also served as a consultant to various NGOs and governments, and regularly appears as a commentator on BBC News, World News, Al Jazeera, and other outlets. So as a high dominance academic, we're delighted to welcome him to deliver his talk on the rebirth of the high dominance liberal. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks so much, Anna. So what I'm talking about today is what concerns all of us most, which is basically why has democracy been derailed in the countries it has been, and what we can do about it. And we've got a standard story out there, and I'm going to refer to what I'm going to talk about as the standard story. And we all know what it is, the standard story of how the bad guys came to power and then what we can do about it. You know, some of us here wrote this story, and, you know, it's something like as follows. You know, during that kind of golden age of the early post-war decades, 1945 to 80, maybe late 80s, but certainly, you know, those 3 or 4 decades after the war, these were a golden age for middle-class expansion and for working class welfare and development. But then by the 1990s, things began to change, and globalization provided a lot of opportunities for the well-schooled, but for those who lacked a college education, things were a little bit different. And what they ended up doing over the following decades was seeing their wages decline, their job satisfaction decline, their job security decline, their financial situation decline, and then, you know, their livelihoods and their wages in jeopardy. They became, you know, this stoked their bigotry. There was something about actually experiencing this decline, this deflation in social status that went along with the decline in material conditions that led them to be more vulnerable to the appeals of right-wing demagogues who promised to restore, you know, religion, homosexuality, heterosexuality, to fight back against that menace. You know, the authority of men, everything that we associate with, you know, the authority of the ethnic majority, everything we associate with traditional values and mores. And Trump in the Trumpized Republican Party were the results. And post-communist Eastern Europe in this story, communist period didn't have a lot of freedom, but it did really provide well for basic needs. It was a time of rapid human development. And after the neoliberals took over in Eastern Europe in the 1990s, that things ended up going south for the ordinary person. Again, great opportunities for the well-schooled and the kind of globalized population, but that most other people actually suffered, you know, suffered a decline in their material status and their social status. And as a result, we got Viktor Orban in Hungary, Andrej Babiš in the Czech Republic, Jaroslav Kaczynski in Poland, and so on. As well as, and this story actually, it's not usually applied quite so specifically, but we kind of assume for the most part that this holds in developing country democracies that have undergone erosion as well. So that I'm including in my study, besides the 3 East European countries I just named, Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, the United States, and also Brazil, India, and the Philippines. Those are 3 major developing world democracies that have all kind of undergone backsliding away from democracy recently. So the prescriptions that we derive from the story are straightforward. Move to the left on the economy and double down on promises and delivery of promises to the working guy. Somehow then we're going to get him back. Also, maybe moderate our policies on social, cultural matters, either compromise a bit with the right on those policies, or just change the topic of the conversation from transgendered high school sports to wages in the 1%. And then this is going to bring the working guy back into the party, or at least just a slice that's going to enable us to overcome this this menace from the right. So I too actually believe this story for many years, and I just started. I think all of us do, basically, in broad outline. But then when I started investigating, I found actually much less empirical support for it than I expected to. So let's just start off by taking a look at some of these basic indicators of human development. And what we're going to see, we'll use the bellwether indicator, which is life expectancy. What we'll see here is that actually this is a time, the decades preceding the rise of the bad guys, is a time of pretty robust human development. Interestingly, we have a phenomenon unique in the world, by the way, which is that for 35 years, life expectancy did not change in communist era countries. Between 1966 and 1991, uniquely in the world, life expectancy remained flat. It was about 70, 71 at the beginning of the period. It was 71 35 years later. Here's what was going on in the world. United States was actually moving up, but here's what happened though. As soon as the neoliberal monsters came to power and kind of like sold the economy out to globalization, then life expectancy begins to rise, and it rises very rapidly in these 3 post-communist countries. In the developing world, we also see remarkable human development. In the Philippines, not as fast as we'd like, but certainly in India and Brazil, we see spectacular progress. Here's another, I throw Venezuela in just to illustrate this. I wondered, so if having a socialist, government regime is I could only find this in these countries in the world, actually as a guarantor of not having human development. What about Venezuela? Like the 21st century is great, like socialist country. Exactly the same thing happens here. Venezuela has a democratic regime for the several decades leading up to Chavez. He comes to power in 1990. And in fact, 1999, and what happens is the same thing that happened in the East European communist countries, really a remarkable phenomenon. If we look at economic growth, we see that for the most part, most of the countries we're looking at here, in the decades leading up to the takeover of the bad guys, they actually do reasonably well. So these are just the figures from 1991 to the date at which the bad guys won. So Trump in the United States, Kaczynski and company in Poland, and so on. And what we see is in most countries, Brazil isn't all that great a growth, and Hungary is a little slow too. Although that's only 19 years taken into account here, because the bad guy comes to power earliest in Hungary. But what we see in the other 4 countries, the other 5 countries certainly, is robust growth as well as the robust development that I just pointed out. Much less fast growth in Germany and Japan. I put them in just for comparative purposes. The 2 other big industrialized democracies in the world where democracy's not been derailed at all. So what about inequalities? The United States, uniquely among these countries, actually experienced some rise in economic inequality during this period, during the decades leading up to the triumph of the bad guys. So, but the interesting thing is, so the Gini coefficient here rose from 35 to 42 between 1979 and the present day. But the interesting thing about this is it rose to 42 during the Reagan era, the Reagan and Bush 1 era. And then in 1993, when Clinton came to office, it stopped growing and it's remained the same for the last 3 decades, right? So the idea that economic inequality has been escalating and that led to the rise of Trump, I think we don't find all that much support for in the data. In Poland, economic inequalities did grow from like a Gini coefficient like 27, 28, kind of communist level Gini at the beginning of transition. It went all the way up to 38 in 2005, and then it's declined, and it was declining pretty steeply since then to 32 at the time that Kaczynski and the Law and Justice Party came to power. Hungary, Czechia have rock bottom Ginis, the lowest in the world, actually. So I put up Finland, Sweden, and Germany here for comparative purposes. What you see is they have Scandinavian level inequalities. The notion that the neoliberals took over and just kind of, busted things up for the working guy, and they saw this escalation in inequality just isn't evident in the data. Philippines see a mild drop before Duterte is elected in 2016. Brazil has a uniquely high Gini coefficient, one of the highest in the world, but it was on the decline. It declined from 63 in 1989 to 53 in 2018 when Bolsonaro, who's the bad guy in Brazil, was elected. So let's look at subjective perceptions, right? So maybe things aren't that bad in terms of economic growth and development or inequalities, but what about subjective perceptions? Now, when I started looking at this data from the General Social Survey in the United States, I expected to find like these downward trends in terms of the way white working class people reported their welfare and their satisfaction. I didn't find anything like that in the data. They're just not there. So these are responses for white people with a high school education alone. Those, after all, after all the demographic that supposedly, in fact, has, and it deserted us for the Republican Party. What we see here is self-reporting on just life satisfaction and happiness. What we see is, of course, actually no overall decline. Overall levels of reported satisfaction with life are the same in 2016 when Trump was elected as they were in 1972, kind of the heart of that golden age that we think of as being especially great for the working guy. What about getting along financially these days? You can look at the question here. What we see also is no major decline among white college-educated, high school-educated people who lack a college education over this time as well. How satisfied are you with the work you do? This is a key part of the standard story that, again, most of us believe, I certainly did, which is that Elizabeth Warren and Bernie and Trump essentially tell the same story here, right? Which is that during those early post-war decades, jobs were plentiful, jobs were good, and there was something kind of rewarding about, making steel and mining coal that then was lost as these jobs in these sectors began diminishing in number, and people had to go to work doing other things. There's something about the dignity of work in these steel plants and in coal mines that you don't get behind the counter or the computer screen or making wind turbines or where the jobs are today. But so people are asked here, what do you think of your job? You happy with it? Well, what we see among white working class people is there's actually no decline in job satisfaction over time. They seem to actually be pretty good with their jobs. They're pretty happy with it. That's what we see. Now, what about social status? This is, again, a big part of the story that I, too, just kind of assumed was true. But what I found out is this idea that working class people feel that the social status has declined is completely speculative. But we don't have any evidence for this at all. And so there's one recent article by this Ocean Vigna. I think it's really a remarkable article where they actually test this. They go back to the best data sources on this, and what they find is there's an interesting question in one of the surveys that asks people where they place themselves in the social hierarchy in the societies. And they broke this down by class: upper middle class, small business owners, lower middle class, skilled workers, unskilled workers. And they took all these different lines. People reported every few years on where they regarded themselves kind of in the social hierarchy. And lo and behold, there's actually no deterioration over time in the United States. In fact, working class people regard themselves as a little higher in the social hierarchy than they did in 1987, which is when the data start. We see in our other backsliders, being Poland and Hungary, similar patterns, right? Hungary has a little dip here. Everybody feels the social status to be declining in Hungary. Hungary's always at a lower absolute level on all these things. Hungarians are always more morose. Like you go to the happiness surveys, 90% of everybody elsewhere says they're happy. Hungarians, it's always like 60% max, right? They have a certain kind of moroseness that I think they kind of get off on. But at any rate, they're like Russians in that respect. Anyway, we just don't see this decline in social status. And I recommend this article to you because they run every possible robustness test. It's really remarkable stuff, and they can't find evidence of a decline in social status, which I think is really, in some ways, a revolutionary finding. What about the idea that we liberals have abandoned the working man, right? We all kind of believe this, and we're all lefties, right? We want to bear down on the progressive economic policy, and I do too. I'm absolutely in favor of this. The problem is, I don't think this is going to win anybody. Oh, it's not going to win folks back over, not the ones we want to win back over. So, look, the Democrats, generally speaking, do a much, much, much better job of defending the material interests of the working guy than the Republicans do. They vote for the Republicans anyway, but we actually do. So just to illustrate this point, I looked up the data on what happens to the taxes of the top wage earners. What you see is basically they fall under Republicans, and then a Democrat comes to power. There's Clinton. They went back up to pre-Reagan levels. Under Clinton, they declined a little bit. They had Bush. They decline much further. Obama comes to office. They go back up. They go down. Now under Biden, this year, they're going to be back at 40% for people who make 400,000 or more. That's the same level they were before Reagan came to office. Really remarkable. And what's more, Democrats raise taxes to fund programs for everybody else, and especially the poor. I think it's hard to argue the Democrats have abandoned the poor. Here are the numbers when Bill Clinton came to office and started his plan to end welfare as we know it. That had tremendous results in child poverty. These are numbers on child poverty. It dropped from 28 to 18% during his time in office alone. Stagnates here. Then in the middle of the Obama period, it starts falling again precipitously. And believe it or not, after 2 years of Biden being in office, for 2022, the level of child poverty in the United States is 5%. It's 1/5 or 1/6 of what it was 3 decades ago. Remarkable progress. And by the way, it's all due to Democrats' policies. It's not that economic growth has been so robust that it could cause this. If you look at this, there are about 11 or 12 policies that the Democrats and the Democrats alone sponsor. Of course, you won't hear this in elections because Democrats never talk about the great triumphs they've had in policy and elections. We just look at what the Republicans are criticizing us for and try to not talk about that. So at any rate, I'll come to that in a few minutes. So, I think there's enough in the data here to make us question the standard story a little bit. And I have to say, it's this skepticism that I'm coming to squares with what I'm getting in the ethnographic literature. So you guys are probably aware of this book. I think it's the greatest work of social science in the century so far. It's the only book I signed to like every class I teach, right? This is the book that really helps you understand why Trump. She went down to to Bayou Country in Louisiana. And she lived there among the folks. My colleague, Arlie Hochschild at Berkeley, she lived there for 5 years off and on with her husband. And what they found in talking with folks down there was not anybody telling them that, boy, we used to be back with the Democrats when my dad was alive, my grandpa, but now with me, now that I'm older, now that I'm older, if they're old people now, or if they're younger with their parents, they used to really defend our labor unions and our wages back then. But the Democrats, they kind of gave up on us and they turned neoliberal. Like, you never hear anybody say that in her book. What's more, I'm from Kentucky and I go home sometimes. Layla and I like to go up to like the Pacific Northwest. We just traipse around Wyoming and Montana and Idaho recently. We love dive bars. We hang out in these places. Kind of this is fun field work, right? This is great. And I know some of you guys do it as well. And I never hear anybody tell me, that you guys like pooped out on defending our material interests. What they do say in Hochschild's book and in my own ethnographic work and all the ethnographic work you can find on why Trump that these journalists write is that we are wimps, weak patriots, and people who think that they're racists. And those the first two things totally turn them off. The third thing just completely angers them. That's the deal. So we could quit being wimps, weak patriots, or projecting the idea that we think that they're bigots. We don't do that, though. What we do is offer another like $1 trillion spending program that they don't want. Again, I love the $1 trillion spending programs. Bear down on them, but don't expect them necessarily to win these guys back. So, and it doesn't make sense that even if the Democratic Party even if you accept the idea and reject what I'm saying, say that the Democrats and their counterparts in East European countries have actually, kind of pulled back from defending the working guy, it doesn't make logical sense that these folks would then start voting for parties that truly don't give a damn about their economic interests at all. In fact, Republicans and Democrats have not converged, but rather diverged very significantly, in large part because the Republicans have turned so far to the right on the economy in the last couple of decades, right? So why would they then go for the Republicans who are completely turning their back on them in the economy, whose only public policy they ever have to offer is tax cuts for rich people? Why would they do that? It doesn't make much sense to me. Well, of course, that brings us to the, a second part of the standard story, which is culture. And the argument here is, well, the Trump and Kaczynski and Orban and these guys, they might not really offer the working guy all that much in terms of material support, but they offer the bigotry. They serve up these heaping piles of bigotry, and everybody loves that. And middle-class voters, working and middle-class people, then throw their lot in with the illiberals. We don't have time to get into that too much here, but this is based on an argument made, I think, in another truly great work of social science that I'm finding I don't really, it doesn't resonate with me in light of the evidence, but I admire that as one of the great works of social science of the century as well. Ron Engelhardt, Pippa Norris make this argument that we live in a uniquely hot time when it comes to cultural conflict and culture wars. We've hit this special tipping point. And at this tipping point, basically, you get this incredible rise of resentment against cultural liberalization that's happened in society over time. And you get this large portion of the population, especially working class people, who then get so angry at things like marriage equality and feminism and other things like that, that they're willing to just throw the towel in on democracy and support somebody like Trump or Kaczynski or Bolsonaro. I don't buy this argument, in part because this idea that there are these vital tipping points, and we've hit one now, and this is like culture wars rage uniquely badly in our time. It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, when I was growing up, I remember in the mid-'60s, I lived in Ypsilanti and in Dearborn, around near Detroit. And I can remember I was 5 years old, and during the '67 riots, my dad took me out in the front yard of where our apartment was. And he said, "You see that glow in the sky? You see what's going on there? Detroit was completely burning." Can you imagine and he explained to me what that was all about and what was going on with the riots there. This kind of thing, are culture wars really hotter in the age of Colin Kaepernick and George Floyd than they were in the age of MLK and Medgar Evers? I really don't think so. And I think we're always hitting these tipping points in culture wars where, as they say, conservatives are losing their cultural hegemony. I don't think there's anything unique about these times in this respect. What's more, actually, I'm just not finding as much support in the data as I expected to for the contention that in some ways this backlash is leading to an overall rise of bigotry among a certain portion of the population. What's more, what do you do with this evidence anyway? I mean, the Democrats and liberals around the world cannot back off of our commitments to feminism, to women's equality, to LGBT equality, to racial justice, and so on. That's not even an option for us. So I think ultimately we need to acknowledge that doubling down on progressive economic policies is great insofar as, I mean, if you're progressive, like I am on this stuff, it does really yield its benefits. I mean, you see it in the child poverty rates. The problem is it doesn't seem to be winning these folks back over. And that's what we plan. We keep offering these policies, hoping that they're going to win the working guy back. But in 2016, a candidate who explicitly basically said he's not going to do anything for the working people except build a wall with Mexico and throw a tariff on some Chinese exporters, right? Came up against a candidate who could not have been better from a kind of liberal standpoint on offering the working person really great economic programs. So then after 4 years in office, when Trump basically did nothing but cut taxes for the very rich, didn't do it, passed all these laws that made union busting easier, every possible regressive policy you can imagine, well, then 67% of white working class people, white non-college educated people came out and voted for him. So that was a 1-point rise, didn't do any good. Biden then puts in place policies that are on the scale and ambition of the Great Society programs, and it works, right? Child poverty falls by half, and the economy's cooking, and unemployment's lower than it's been since 1969. Economic growth in 2021 was higher than it's been since 1984. Never hear the Democrats talk about this, do you? They don't talk about that stuff. God forbid they actually get the good news out. That would be unkind to those who still suffer. That's another problem though with messaging that I don't have time to get into now, but that plays a prominent role in the book manuscript that I'm writing. At any rate, this stuff isn't working. After in the midterms, Biden with all these progressive policies, we haven't seen anything like this since Johnson. 66% of the white working class, non-college educated people with high school degrees go to the Republicans. Our support among Hispanic voters continues to erode. There was an 8-point swing toward the Republicans in 2020. In Trump's second re-election effort, most Hispanic voters are working class, and then we lose 2 more points in the midterms. If this trend continues, we are cooked. We're not going to be able to win any national elections anymore in the United States. So clearly, these policies aren't working, and you can't say we're not trying, right? You simply can't say that we're not trying anymore. So why have so many folks moved away from the Democrats and liberal parties elsewhere? This is terra incognita, since almost all of us buy the standard story I've been articulating, right? We all believe this. We wrote it. This is the way we think. So, but we urgently need to find other reasons why the illiberals are winning, because our causes don't seem to actually, the prescriptions we infer from them don't seem to be doing all that much good. We really need to find other reasons than the purported rise in job insecurity and dissatisfaction. And we need remedies beyond trying to convince the working man that we and not the Republicans are going to cover his pre-existing conditions, because we've been doing this for decades and it does not work electorally. Policies are great. They have their socioeconomic effects that we want them to. They do not have the political effects we intend them to. So when we reconsider this question, we step back again. I think it helps to say, so, what did Modi have that Rahul Gandhi didn't? So what does Bolsonaro have that Fernando Haddad, his 2018 opponent, didn't, but that Lula has, right? What did Duterte have that Mar Rojas didn't? Trump that Hillary Clinton didn't, and so on. And for the most part, it's hard to argue that these democracy-degrading member of each one of these pairs won on promising or having a better record on delivering socioeconomic equality or a better shake for the working guy. The quick resort then we say is, well, they were better bigots, and that's certainly true. But for the most part, they won in growingly liberal societies in which, if you look at the data, working classes are very much taking part in this liberalization. This idea we have, this upper middle class and upper class idea that the working classes are getting more bigoted while we get more liberal is actually not true. It doesn't find support in the data. They're not actually as far behind us as we think, and their attitudes are moving in the right direction. So, what strikes me about these guys is that what they did do was they cultivated an image for being able to own their opponents. This isn't just an American thing, Republican, Democrat. The whole notion of owning your opponents, of dominating them, of being stronger than the liberals are, of taking care of business and protecting the nation and promoting national greatness and glory better than the liberals do. This is actually a common thread we find in all these cases. Their claimed superiority for strength and as nationalists, and not just ethno-nationalists, really resonate especially strongly among the demographics that I was just mentioning, that Layla and I just saw in our trip, and where I'm from in Kentucky, and the people that Hochschild talks about as well. You know, so take a case like India, where Modi's bigotry gets all the attention because he's such an awful Islamophobe. But really, if you look more carefully to India, from what I can see, what really thrills people in India about Modi and explains his constant 70% approval rating is less the like hardcore Islamophobia and more this like excitement about Team India, like India taking on the world as a nation that he seems to inspire in people. We focus on the Islamophobia. Most Indians actually responding, I think, to something else. Also, what's common here is that liberal parties seem to have become kind of what we might call low dominance actors, who have largely forsaken nationalism as well and failed to build a compelling democratic national narrative to counter the autocratic or illiberal national narratives propagated by democracy's opponents. So the problem in my view is one of messaging. It's not one of policy. It's one of packaging and presentation. This is something that we can change on a dime. You actually do not need to, put in place policies that will change the Gini score over decades, right? And somehow lighten the rage of the working man against immigrants by somehow restoring a more satisfactory level of socioeconomic inequality. And across the board, the liberals' positions, at any rate, as we know, are always more popular than the bad guys, right? And yet they keep winning elections like half the time or so. So, what this is all about is propensity and ability to wrap one's program in an optimistic narrative about national progress and national greatness. It's also about propensity and ability to rhetorically dominate one's opponents, to own them rather than be owned by them, to convince voters of one's superior fortitude and guts, not just one's greater compassion and eagerness to serve the material interests of this or that purportedly hurting or struggling working class group. If you ever heard the Democrats ever mention working people or working families without the word hurting or struggling being in the same sense, you know what this sounds like to ordinary folks? Like, it sounds very condescending. It's just not the way they experience their lives, right? Hillary Clinton was big on this. We still are in general. What's more, people, the people we're talking about don't call themselves working families. Like, I've never heard a working family call themselves a working family. That's just not the kind of way that they talk about themselves. So projecting one's superiority for strength and for patriotism is not something that came hard to the mid-20th century liberals who basically ran American politics for the middle third of the 20th century and put in place every policy that we're now fighting a rearguard action to defend. What's more, it certainly didn't come hard to Nehru or to Lech Wałęsa. These guys actually understood the power not only of nationalism, but of dominance, of actually being perceived of as being stronger than their opponents. Today's liberals, though, 21st century liberals, certainly in the United States, tend to think of dominance. Even when I mention this word, we just kind of tighten up. Liberals really don't like the idea of dominance, right? We regard it as bellicose, toxically masculine, personalistic, dictatorial, hubristic, egocentric, uncivilized, and not to mention downright tacky, right? And the global predominance of the Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the Modis and so on among the high dominance crowd only reinforces our notion, our kind of stereotypes of what a high dominance leader looks like. Most of us tend to think about dominance in politics the way we think about nationalism, which is an atavism that's going to kind of evolve away, right, as we evolve and mature as a species. But I'm finding the only place where there's any literature on dominance that isn't just this kind of knee-jerk association of it with authoritarian personalities that actually analyzes it in some depth is the psych literature and the neuroscience literature. And when you look to those literatures, what you see is, Dan McAdams wrote a really interesting article recently where he said that basically if we're waiting for dominance traits for craving for dominance in political leaders to evolve away, we're going to be waiting hundreds of thousands of years. Like, this is not going to happen anytime soon. It's in our DNA. So, in the United States, there have been a lot of calls for Democrats to get tough and quit being weak, but there hasn't really been any systematic effort to theorize what is meant by not being weak. What do we mean by being strong, right? And that's what I'm trying to do in my work, is to come up with this kind of theory of dominance that we can use as a template for understanding this phenomenon, and then figuring out what we can actually do to overcome this dominance deficit. So here's what high dominance leadership is. It's reality shaping and conflict embracing, and it favors the language of the aggressor, the righteous, and the triumphant. Low dominance leadership is reality taking and conflict averse, and it inclines to the language of the aggressed upon and the endangered. So let's take these elements of dominance. Reality shaping. A high dominance leader strives to make opinion rather than taking it. He crafts a narrative that casts himself and his allies as forebears of an intrepid, as intrepid, successful protagonists. He celebrates past victories and treats them as harbingers of greater things to come. High dominance leaders have redemptive stories. Bernie Sanders is high dominance in some ways. He does not have a redemptive story. MLK did, Kennedy did, Nehru certainly did. A high dominance leader treats narratives and beliefs that oppose his own as falsehoods, not valid alternatives. He asks not what do the people believe, but what do I want them to believe? He follows up on provocative statements by doubling down, not backing down. His message does not shift and sync with public opinion, doesn't evolve along with public opinion, and he doesn't assume his audience knows the truth. He pounds it home, hammers it home every chance he gets. Conflict embracing, what is that all about? The high dominance leader prefers offensive to defensive posture and preemption to reaction. He seeks to win, not just avoid loss. He's risk acceptant, not risk averse. He embraces us versus them framing. He treats opponents as foes, not would-be partners or collaborators. And these things have distinctive payoffs that I've actually put at the bottom of the slide. So in archetypal exaggerated form, focusing on the United States with no attention to nuance, let me tell you what this looks like. And I think some of you are actually going to are going to know what I'm talking about here. While the Republicans seek to make opinion, we take opinion. When opinion doesn't move in the Republicans' way, they double down. When it doesn't move in our way, we back down. And the Democrats fact check the Republicans seek to create new facts on the ground. The Republicans pursue even unpopular policies with abandon. We just look at opinion polls, issue polls. That's what drives our every move in the Democratic Party. And we refrain from defending even popular policies sometimes out of fear that our opponents will attack them and the polls might turn against us. The Republicans act as if their party has more support than it does and their policies. We act as if our policies have less support than they actually do. The Republicans tell voters what they think. We tell voters what we think they want to hear. When the Republicans say something inflammatory that meets with opprobrium, they double down on it. When Democrats do such a thing, we walk it back or apologize for it. The Republicans pound their truths, or in their case, many times lies, into people's heads. What the Democrats do is present our case every now and then and hope the audience will connect the dots. We think it's kind of tacky to keep repeating yourself all the time. Unfortunately, that's exactly what you have to do in politics to get your message across. The Republicans tailor their messaging to stir their base. We tailor our messaging to not stir their base, right? So all of politics now is about Trump's MAGA 20%, right? Because we don't want to inflame them and Trump wants to inflame them. That's typical low versus high dominance behavior. The Republicans treat even petty wins as triumphs. We treat even transformational feats. Well, we just don't trumpet them at all. Some of the information I just gave you, you never will hear Joe Biden say, right? In fact, this is what we should take to the midterm. We didn't do it. Republicans savor conflict and treat us as enemies. This is in the conflict embracing part. The Democrats regard us versus them politics as distasteful. That's something we want to avoid. The Republicans play offense, we play defense. The Republicans attack, we react. The Republicans risk it and play to win. Democrats abhor risk and hope not to lose. The Republicans use entertaining, aggressive, provocative parlance. The Democrats bore voters with bromides about struggling working families. The Republicans cast themselves as imposing indomitable, menacing, triumphant. The Democrats present themselves as imposed upon, vulnerable, menaced, offended, perpetually in danger of defeat. The Republicans call their opponents weak, lame, gutless, pathetic, disloyal, unpatriotic, clueless, and immoral. We charge the Republicans with being callous, ruthless, terrifying, frightening, and offensive. The Democrats call the Republicans bullies, and we leave them in charge of the playground. Now, to be sure, there is such a thing as being, too carried away with high dominance. Oops, I missed that slide. Sorry about that. Hang on just one second. So I think it's safe to say that in 20th century politics, for sure, the Republicans are all over in terms of dominance, and we are not. And this is why I think DeSantis is doing well. My mom lives in Florida. I visit there frequently. Floridians aren't just, it's not like 80% of Floridians are intoxicated with, excluding African Americans from the curriculum. In fact, if you look at the numbers, those positions are not even that popular. What DeSantis has is cojones. That's what you hear again and again from people, and especially from the Latino voters who I've spoken with a lot near where my mom lives. They don't care about these policies. He's got guts. And who do we put up against him? Charlie Crist. I won't go into Charlie Crist here, but suffice it to say that he's kind of, one of our lower dominance politicians in a field full of them. So you can't go too far. I mean, Putin thinks he's going to take over Ukraine with 150,000 troops, or these Republicans in the United States thinking they're to push through these abortion bans without any political consequences. We're obviously kind of delusional dominance politics run amok. If you're a reality-shaping politician, but that your approach is untempered by a grasp for the reality that one seeks to shape, that can lead to defeat and disaster for one's causes. But we have to acknowledge the fact that wild high dominance overreach is not a problem for liberals these days. This is not a problem we suffer from. On the contrary, we need a hell of a lot more of it. So, this dominance gap actually really does seem to exist, and it has political consequences. So, in survey after survey, I keep finding this, right? When you ask people what they associate the Democrats with, and the Republicans, or Biden and Trump, or the politicians, like weak is always the top word in these surveys. Like over half of Americans, the first thing they think of is the Democrats are weak, right? Strong is, you got a 13-point gap there. That's enormous. Republicans have a positive gap on strong versus weak. It's 5. They're more, we're both viewed as extreme by the other party, but that's a huge, this actually matters. In these exit polls that are done after presidential elections, a strong leader always trumps all these other values that people want in presidential candidates. Here it's trumping, shares my values, unite the country, cares about people like me. They always come in second or third to these other strengths. Like people really want that, especially I think in executive leaders. So where do we find high dominance liberals? Well, that guy obviously is one of them. And I think that's the reason why he just vanquished Bolsonaro and saved democracy in Brazil in the bargain. If Biden and the Democrats dealt with Trump like Lula and his party deal with Bolsonaro, the notion of a second Trump term would be ridiculous. We wouldn't be worried about that. Similarly, if Biden dealt with Trump and the Republicans like he deals with Putin and the Russians, Biden, we'd also be set, right? Biden is a high dominance monster on the global scene. The problem is he just doesn't do it at home. And I think part of our job is to get him to actually start doing that. We also see, of course, in Eastern Europe and Europe as a whole, a rise of this new generation of high dominance liberals. And of course, dominance, in liberals manifests differently. We're not just charging alpha chimps like Trump, right? I mean, this is all, we want to own our opponents, but we do so in a liberal way, right? We also cultivate a reputation for other qualities. Zelensky's obviously the guy. I mean, this guy is owning Putin. He has crafted a brand of anti-ethno-national nationalism in a country that's formerly linguistically divided. He's been doing this for years, by the way. This really predates his presidency. He's doing pretty much everything that I think liberals need to be doing in the West and around the world to fight back against the illiberal menace. We also see a raft of other high dominance liberals emerging, many of them good nationalists as well, liberal nationalists, of course, inclusive nationalists, who are who have a kind of democratic national story that they can use to clobber these illiberal, ethno-national, cramped national stories that the illiberals actually tell. these leaders are a whole new generation. Most of them actually run countries that are on the western edge of Russia. And they are the leaders. They are the leaders of, they're kind of the leaders who form that third leg in the triad of resistance to Putin that is working magnificently, with Biden and Zelensky being the other ones. So, you know, if we look at these liberals who've actually been able to put down ethno-national challenges, the ones who've really kicked the butts of the ethno-nationalists, what we see is people have the kind of qualities that I'm talking about. So Kaja Kallas just won an overwhelming victory in her bid for re-election. And Estonia's got its Trump, right? Martin Helm, who is, you know, complaining that the world's best, the completely bulletproof electoral system might not work very well. So maybe the vote count wasn't really right. He loves Trump. He says so. All the usual right-wing nonsense. She just kicks his butt. And one of the ways she does, she just owns him rhetorically. She also owns Putin, which actually looks pretty good. Here's another one, Maya Sandu. I really like her. She beat this little, you know, Trumpian worm, Golden, in 2000. A Putin-philic guy who, if Moldova were still under his presidency right now, Moldova would indeed be trouble. Maya Sandu did an exceptionally good job, and she beat him roughly 60-40 in 2000. It saved Moldova from more of this kind of nonsense. Slovakia has a liberal president who is actually doing, you know, very much what these other leaders I'm talking about doing. Here's another favorite, Petr Pavel. He just beat a very imposing opponent, Andrej Babiš, who is almost as bad as Trump. I mean, most of these leaders we look at, it's like, they're not bad as Trump. This guy is actually as bad as Trump, right? Babiš is, and he's just like Trump. He's a slimy billionaire, you know, guy who stole all his money, and he did it all illegally, and he's pro-Putin, he's ethno-national, he's gross, right? And what Pavel does is Pavel comes along. He's the former director of the military committee of NATO. He's a war hero. He's former director of chief of staff. And he just dominates Babiš, who actually dominated Czech politics for years. He was prime minister between 2017, 2021. Then he ran for president again. The cancer of Babiš has now been excised from Czech politics due to that guy. And this guy is what high dominance nationalism looks like. Very liberal on social policies, very liberal, kind of a centrist on the economy, but he didn't beat Babiš by offering the working man a better shake. He beat Babiš by dominating and ridiculing him exactly the way you're supposed to do, using high dominance language. This guy is just the deal, right? So he campaigned on a motorcycle. You know, his opponents were passing around this rumor that he served in the security services during the Soviet period, which he did. So he immediately puts out this thing about himself as 007, right? Yeah, I was a spy. What, you know, that's just kind of what we did back then. Very liberal. The outgoing president, who is very much a political enemy of him, is a hopeless alcoholic who's constantly seen in public just falling down. Miloš Zeman is his name. And the way Pavel creates a contrast with Zeman is here he is skydiving, jumping out of airplanes, riding his motorcycle up. And yet, okay, all this macho stuff, I know liberals don't like this, right? Toxically masculine. No, it's not. Like, this guy's a total liberal on social issues. He's a real gentleman. And what's more than that, he's a military leader and somebody who's going to actually, as I said, deliver the Czech Republic and Central Europe from this cancer of neoliberalism that Babiš actually represented. So let me finish up with what I mean by high dominance rhetoric. Very briefly, each one of these clips is just a few seconds long. This is my very favorite high dominance European liberal. Her name is Sanna Marin. She is the Prime Minister of Finland. She's 36 years old. And this is like what I'm talking about here. In this first clip, she's asked, after Biden and Macron were saying, maybe Putin needs an off-ramp, right? Okay, let's give him an off-ramp, be a little face saving. This is her response to the off-ramp suggestion.
Your reaction, please, to President Biden's comment last night that Vladimir Putin may need an off-ramp to avoid a nuclear Armageddon.
Off-ramp? What do you mean?
From the conflict, a way out of the conflict.
Way out of the conflict. The way out of the conflict is for Russia to leave Ukraine. That's the way out of the conflict. Thank you.
I love the derisive laugh at the end, like, what kind of an idiot would even ask that question, right? So
I know that you don't like to talk about your role as a very young woman in this very important job.
And we don't have to. You know, we don't have to go there.
I'm going to ask you, where, but there is a public fascination with it. So let me ask you this. Has there been some part of that that you look back on and see as a legacy?
Most of my time has gone with the major crises that we have faced.
There you go. That's her response to Zakaria. You saw your response to the question on Putin. Now, I know it's time for me to do the knee-jerk American liberal thing, right, and point out the gender and the youth of all those people on the slides, except for Pavel that I mentioned. But after hearing your response to Zakaria, I'm not going to go there myself. So that's all. That's all I got.
Thank you very much.
So.
We will go there, and Catherine will lead the Q&A.
Yes, I will. Okay, I'll make a little list here. All right, Sherry, I saw you first, Hisham, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Go ahead, Sherry.
Oh, thank you, Steve. There's a lot here.
Yeah, and just introduce yourself.
Oh, I'm Sherry Berman. I'm a visitor here at CDDRL. So, Steve, thank you for this. There's a lot I agree with, but I think there's a lot that you distort. So let me start with the agreement part. Messaging obviously matters, and it matters particularly for national leaders. I think you're doing a lot of picking on your dependent variable here. I could come up with a lot of leaders who are high dominance, who lost, and some who won and who were not, but I'm going to put that aside. I mean, you sort of discount some of the standard explanations in ways that I think hurt you rather than help you. So for instance, you talk about how liberals have, basically helped working class and low income people. And you talk about things like the welfare state, but the literature actually doesn't focus on those kinds of things. It focuses on things like trade and deregulation, which in the United States, for instance, and in Eastern Europe, I'll defer to you on those, I mean, really happened under left governments. I mean, opening up of trade, deregulation, these were Carter, these were Clinton, and a lot of the best work that's been done on shifts in voting looks at these kinds of things, right? So I think it's important to recognize that voters don't focus on particular policies. You're right about that, but they have a perception that Democrats oversaw this period of opening up of trade and deregulation, which is entirely true. And if we look at the 2016 election, for instance, with Clinton and Trump, you know this as well as I do, all of the surveys say that voters saw Trump as more moderate on the economy than, for instance, Romney. We know that's not true, but that's what they understood him to be. And they associated Clinton with all of these kind of, globalization, deregulation stuff that, she was frankly vulnerable on. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot, I think the explanations there are a lot more complicated than the sort of simplistic black and white kind of thing that you present there. And on the cultural stuff, you mentioned Hawkshield's book. That is a great book, but your interpretation of it, I think, is a slightly unfair one. I mean, what she finds, right, is that the people that she speaks to, probably, some of the same people you meet in bars and things like that these people feel left behind. They feel ignored. They feel like their politicians have not paid attention to them, and that other people, very easily manipulated as minorities or immigrants or whatever, have been able to jump in line in front of them. And for this, they blame politicians. And so someone who comes with an anti-establishment message like Trump, right, therefore is able to play on the kinds of things that Hochschild and Kathy Kramer and others kind of talk about in a way that someone like Clinton clearly was not. So I would just say that I think that the economic and cultural stuff, I agree with you, it's complicated, but I think the way that you present it is very strawman-y, and I think it's going to make you very vulnerable to people who know the specifics of these cases, because I think the way you talk about it is yeah, I think it's
possibly unfair. If I could find evidence for what you're saying that was really convincing, I wouldn't be so strong about this. What I find in the literature on this, and I have studied this literature on these efforts to try to understand why people are turning to liberal populist parties. So in the literature on Western Europe in particular, there are just a raft of studies that try to find that, first of all, assume it's got to be the economy, right? It can't possibly be anything else, right? And so they go after, trade. Let's look at trade. What they find is that workers without a college education are 4% more likely in Switzerland to vote for an illiberal party if they work in a trade-exposed industry or something like that, right? And okay, so what do you do with that? First of all, the data are inconclusive even on that. There's a lot of data that actually show that they're not more likely to vote for illiberals. And even if they do, does that is that kind of, is that really the most important thing determining their vote? What's more, another problem with this literature is that, first of all, it doesn't focus on countries where there's serious democratic backsliding. I mean, the fact that the AfD party in Germany gains a few percentage point in election isn't a threat to democracy. The countries where we really would expect to see effects would be Eastern Europe and the United States. And it's true, Trump did the anti-trade rhetoric very effectively. But this idea that the way you characterize Hochschild's book is these people feel forgotten, they feel left behind. Certainly true. They don't feel left behind by Trump. They don't feel left behind by the Republican Party. They go out and vote for them, right? And if you ask these people why they're voting for them, they'll, for the most part, tell you that Trump understands them. Trump owns the Democrats. Trump is in charge. The Democrats are weak. They're wimps. They're not good patriots, right? The snobs. They think we're racist. That's what they tell you, and that's what Hochschild reports in her book. I don't exclude that, and I absolutely do need to be, take more account of the literature you're talking about. I have delved into that literature, and what I don't find is, in fact, I just a couple of days ago was reading Helen Milner's article you're probably familiar with in CPS, where she gets into this. And the bottom line is, in some counties, she did it kind of at the county level, as I recall, in European countries, in Germany and Switzerland, these other countries, which, by the way, actually haven't had a lot of democratic backsliding, that there is some effect of being in a trade-exposed industry, that people in those industries are more likely to vote for but only marginally more likely to vote for illiberal parties. So what do you do with that, right? So what, reverse globalization, throw up tariff walls on Chinese imports? You can't, nobody's going to do that, right? And it's the same thing in the United States. Even if you can show these relationships, no one's going to reverse globalization. It's not going to happen, right? And I do have a problem with blaming Bill Clinton and the Democrats for these policies. What was Bill Clinton supposed to do? Just not participate in globalization? This kind of reject trade with China, keep erect high tariff barriers to avoid interaction with China. I think Bill Clinton did about as good a job as you can possibly do at taking advantage of the enormous advantages of globalization, at the same time that he also eased the path as the best he could. Poverty rates fell. A lot of great things happened under Clinton. Now, I'm with you on the dereg, right? The financial dereg actually is just really, really stupid. But if you look at his socioeconomic policies, I think the guy did an exceptionally good job. And I think accusing him of neoliberalism, or Obama also gets accused of neoliberalism, abandoning the working man. I don't know what the alternative was. I guess the United States could have become basically a second-rate industrial power by
That's just not, I don't want to dominate this, but that's just, there's a huge
dominating
on this, and this is just not that's not what the counter case is.
But what I'm saying is that's the logical implication. Nobody follows through and says undo globalization.
I'm sorry, Steve, but the argument is, right, that and as the Norris and Engelhardt book is sort of a good indication of that, is that there's a connection between the ability to exploit these cultural grievances and these economic variables, that those two things work together in ways. It's not an either or, it's a both together. And so, you have to sort of understand what the underlying kind of dynamics there are. And that's not.
So
Sure.
Yes, but go ahead.
I want to make sure that we bring in a couple of other questions. And I know you'll have lots of opportunities to respond to her. Yeah, I see you, but Hisham is next.
Thank you, by the way, Sherry. That's great stuff.
Hisham? Yeah, no, Ed, I understand.
Thank you very much, Hisham Sallam. I work here at CDRL, and I have a couple of quick questions for you. The first is, you kind of suggested that the culture war argument is not really pertinent to this discussion of sort of what goes down, why the left is losing and the decline of the left, etc. But almost everything that you've discussed regarding kind of the traits of low dominance versus high dominance politicians revolves around questions of masculinity, gender, projected masculinity, in such a way where it kind of makes me wonder. The culture wars themselves, gender, sexuality, gender identity, sovereignty over one's sexual identity, reproductive rights, et cetera. These are also front and center, which makes me wonder whether these distinctions that you're capturing through the concept of the binary of low dominance versus high dominance is in fact part and parcel of the culture wars, or what is characterized as culture wars. My second quick question, if I may, is do you worry at all about tautology and kind of like providing a causal story here? I know this is kind of, presented in the spirit of theory building and everything, but at some point, once we get to that theory testing part, I mean, one will kind of start wondering. So they're low dominance, or they're losing elections because they're low dominance, and they're low dominance because they're losers, right? So how can we kind of like separate those two things, especially as we're categorizing and coding kind of politicians, who's low dominance, who's the high dominance, and what's the evidence for it, and what are the standards for it? Especially, I could think of so many clips of Hillary Clinton that we could have tagged on to the end of the presentation, suggesting that she is in fact high dominance.
Yeah,
and
like
that she is-
For sure.
deplorables, that they're deplorable.
Yeah, and what did she do? What did she do? The day after she issued that statement, which is the only high dominance thing she ever said, she finally departed from script and told you what she really thought. And interestingly, in her statement, she said there's two baskets of people. One is deplorable. Those people are hopeless. The other one are these like, good, reasonable folks. But the way she presented the good, reasonable folks, all the press looked at the deplorables being offended. That didn't matter. They're not going to vote for anyway. And her math is perfect. It's probably half and half, right? Deplorables and these other people aren't necessarily racist. What did she do? She said, these people are hurting. They're struggling. They don't want to see their kids go off and die, kill themselves with heroin. They don't know where to turn. They need our help. And we need to show compassion to them. I'm telling you, that was emblematic of why Hillary lost. That approach to the gettable working guy is so condescending, rang so poorly in their ears. That was the problem. Instead of realizing that and talking to working people a little bit differently than she did, or instead of sticking with her, calling the deplorables deplorable, which they actually are, the next day and doubling down on that and exciting her supporters and cowing her opponents, what did she do? She half walked it back. She apologized. She basically said, I didn't really mean that. And then the collective groan went up from progressives because she wouldn't stick by her, and she was just one big demoralization parade, right, for liberals during the campaign, because she never said anything. She never told you what she actually thought. Ultimate low dominance kind of trait, right? She just obeyed the polls. That's one thing. On the dominance and gender thing, look, I mean, these are not like toxically masculine. Wait, where's my screen?
Oh, sorry.
These are not toxically masculine people. They're just not. I mean, the dominance thing is.
Ursula von der Leyen as a dominant. I mean, these are some funny choices.
What? Well, how so?
Sorry.
No, what I'm saying is these are gender conforming young women for the most part. I mean, you don't have to be masculine. You don't have to be a Trumpy high dominance. This is the liberal response always. But we can't be like that. And this is all like gender and.
You don't have to be a man to project masculinity.
It's not masculinity to project. It's strength.
He's saying
It's strength. It's dominance. These are not masculine people, right? At all. They're gender, for the most part. Look at Sanna Marin. Look at Kaya Kalas. They're incredibly gender conforming, very feminine young women, right? But they're strong. Their ovarian fortitude overmatches their opponent's testicular fortitude every time. And that's why they win elections. This is not about strength. See, I think you're making the mistake of associating strength and dominance with maleness. That's exactly what I'm saying is not going on in the world, right? And I don't think we should think about it that way. And to the extent that we do, I think we limit our options. You also mentioned the possibility of, possible tautology. No, I mean, I think I'm separating out whether you won an election or not. That's separate. And then we can observe the kind of dominance traits of the leaders. It's not like the high dominance guy always wins, but he or she definitely tends to have an advantage. And in fact, this is what we lack that they've got. We don't lack progressive economic policies that they have, right? I mean, they still have it. Everything Sherry said, taking that for granted, the Democrats did preside over some liberalization. The Republicans are still 10 times worse in this respect, or worse in terms of the effects for the working people, right? So I think we can separate out these variables pretty clearly. Now, honestly, measuring dominance and coding it and do it, that can't really be done very easily. I got to admit, I mean, some of my work, and I want to get this out before the election, right? Some of this, it can't be coded very easily. And political scientists come along and try to do it. And 20 years from now, they're still going to be trying to do it. I think this has to be basically told, in anecdotes. I don't think you're going to code this very well. One guy tried to do it, and it didn't work out very well. Maybe somebody will come along and try to do it, but I don't think it's going to be very easy.
Okay, so we have a few more questions, and I do see you. I'm just going to insert just my priority is or prerogative as chair to say one one or two little things. So on some of the measures, I mean, you could regress some of these, and people have, right? So I would say it's not that there's necessarily a decline. I mean, you pointed out GDP is going up in some of these places, and there is some decline in many places in terms of inequality. But some of those just, are not huge declines in inequality. And it's more, not so much that it's increasing, it's that my neighbor seems to be doing better, but I'm not. And my neighbor, who may have darker skin than me, seems to be doing better, and I'm not. And I used to be able to, which is why Make America Great Again resonated, I think. The other thing is, of course, Trump lost, after all, with this high dominance thing in 2020, and the Republicans lost in a sense, although they won the House, obviously. They were supposed to take the Senate. They didn't. They were going to take the House by a lot more. They didn't. And Trump is suggesting effectively deglobalization. And that is his policy, throw up those high tariffs. So, right. How do you deal with that? I could go on, but
this is great, Catherine. Thank you. I'll just take these one at a time.
Okay,
So,
and then I'll turn to you.
yeah, sure. So, not a huge decline. Okay, so there's not a huge decline in inequality. So, like, you turn to fascism because there's not a huge decline in inequality. There's a moderate decline in inequality in many of these cases. I just don't associate that with. I don't think equality has to be radically diminishing all the time in order for ordinary folks to be satisfied. My neighbor's doing better than me. Your neighbor can't always be doing better than you if everybody's kind of, doing pretty much the same way. And this idea that my black neighbor's doing better than me, maybe we tell them that and that's why they believe it. Trump tells them that, and that's why they believe it too. But let's face it, we're culpable for this as well. We also tell that story. It's not true. It's not true. If you look at the data, black people are not moving up relative to white people. They're moving in pretty much the same direction at the same pace, maybe even falling a little bit behind in the last 2 decades. This notion that whites have, what's that?
I don't think we do tell people that black people are doing better. I think we tell them. Therefore we need affirmative action.
We tell them that we are giving them all the possible help we can, and hopefully there's going to be a result from that. But I see your point. I agree with it. Certainly, Trump is telling them that. But what we need to say in one way or another, you don't do this in the political campaign, is they're not catching up with them. I mean, how everybody can believe this when it's just not true is another one of those mysteries. And again, back on the farm where I'm from, people don't complain about that. They don't see like black people doing better than they do. They're aware of these are much more race mixed environments than we live in, by the way, right? And they don't see black people doing a lot better than they are. They do see them getting special privileges. They do see affirmative action in the workplace. They see affirmative action in university admissions, and that does actually piss them off. That's another question. I think the Democrats deal very poorly with making a kind of national greatness and welfare argument for support for African Americans and other people of color. So the Republicans did lose in 2020. Absolutely. I mean, Trump is so awful, right? And Biden's pretty good. So I'm not saying that dominance always carries you forward to victory. I'm just saying it gives you an advantage, right? Maybe not a huge advantage, but one that can actually be crucial in elections. 2022. Look, if the Republicans had not borne down on advancing policies that force children to bear the offspring of their rapists, we would have a Republican Senate right now. Everybody knows this. We have 53 or 54 Republican senators. It would certainly include Senators Adam Laxalt and Herschel Walker. That's what we would have done. That's what would have happened if abortion bans wouldn't have come along. We have nothing to celebrate in terms of our own behavior in that election. This was the ultimate low dominance show, and I'm going to go into that if you want to talk about it later, that the Democrats put on. We were going to run on our big economic accomplishments for these huge, wonderful spending programs we pushed through. And that's what we're going to run on. Those are great accomplishments. But rather than trumpet those, as soon as the Republicans said these are inflationary, we backed off and quit talking about them. People had spent their political careers, like Raphael Warnock, working for these spending programs, quit talking about them because the Republicans were saying they're inflationary. So we ran a quick poll to see what the damage was. 3% of Americans believe that story. So we could quit propagating. Again, a profoundly low dominance move that no Republican will be caught dead actually engaging in.
Okay, I'm going to move to the next 2 questions because Frank, we have to finish at 1:15. So
Great.
Hold off for a second on your responses. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Claude. My name is Claude Ezron. I'm from a community in Palo Alto and also very active with the Democratic clubs here. First, thanks for a very thought-provoking talk. I have a couple of questions related to only US politics. The first one is when you look at the current democratic leaders in the US, who do you see has with this type of characteristics, as very strong leaders? Are there some names that come to your mind? Very dominant leaders. And the second question is, I'm wondering if being dominant is a bit against the DNA of Democrats, because when you look at your slides, there are many aspects that you listed that are not very ethical. For instance, considering that your opponents are enemies or lying.
Why is that unethical? If they're lying and they are enemies, why does considering being enemies unethical? See, you hear your liberal mentality. I get it too. I hear the same voice. It's wrong. There's nothing unethical about treating liars like liars and people who treat you like sworn enemies as sworn enemies. In fact, you got to do that or you are going to be at a disadvantage, right? So on your other point, is it in our DNA? It is, and I've actually got a section I've written just in the last month or so on this. There are reasons why Democrats, liberals, have become lower dominance politicians over time. There's a lot of these things like us versus them politics that you rightly mentioned that are that we resist. The problem is without an us, without a them, there can't be an us. All relations are hierarchical and relational. And if you're not going to do us versus them politics, which everybody knows actually except the Democrats that politics is all about, you don't form strong in-group identities because there's no them and there's no sense of moral superiority. So why should people join your team instead of another team? At any rate, I'll leave that there for now. I'm sorry, I'm not really doing it justice. Who are the high dominance Americans, right? So
Democrats.
High dominance American Democrats. Nancy Pelosi is certainly like the guts of the American operation. The problem is she was very hemmed in. She had to run this low dominance party for all these years, but she was actually really good. And she's finished her career with this flourish of high dominance policy. You go to Taiwan, go to the conference on liberating Crimea and Croatia. She's really a good example, but unfortunately she's retired now. She was incredibly effective, obviously, over her career. And other than that, Gavin Newsom is not bad. He's a little too pretty and he's a little too slick, right, to be our guy, but he's actually very good. The governor of Kentucky, where I'm from, Andy Beshear, watch him. He's progressive as Bernie is, but Kentuckians love him. During COVID, he's incredibly authoritative. He did this weekly thing in COVID where he report the deaths and tell Kentuckians, wear your masks. You got to put your children first. That's what we're going to do here. Supreme Court, of course, got rid of those gubernatorial mask mandates, and he went on. Opinion was against him, and people still love Andy Beshear, and there's a reason why he does. He also doesn't talk about poor, working, struggling families. He actually talks to people the way they want to be talked to, which is with respect. He's a good one. Ruben Gallego. What is he in his second term now from Arizona? Watch that guy. He's going to be the next senator from after we get rid of the dingbat dino, in Arizona.
I hate to interrupt you, but I know we have a few more questions.
I think Frank was next.
Aisha and Frank really fast.
Yeah.
And
Aisha Yamdo, I work at the there as well. My question is about this democratic national story that you mentioned. Your sort of theory reminded me of the spin dictators by Greer and Chisholm, and your seems to be
the what? I'm sorry.
Spin dictators.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah, and yours is more like a spin Democrats,
Mm-hmm.
So the question here is like, what is the democratic national story? How can it be written? How can it be shaped in societies that are ethnically divided, politically polarized? So what are the
think about the American national story, which is never told by Democrats. David Brooks had a great article a couple of years ago where he said the Republicans have a national story. First of all, he started off by saying you can't win big time in politics these days without a national story. He said the Republicans have one. It's the good, decent, native-born people of the heartland are suffering under the from neglect and being looked down on by liberal elites on the coast in alliance with ethnic minorities, and that's kind of their story.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yes.
There's the guy who wrote a book called Identity. So I just want to make sure that he
Is he leaving?
No, Frank.
Oh, Frank, of
Yeah,
course. I want to get to Frank for sure.
Yeah. So can I just interrupt you and collect Frank?
Oh,
And
absolutely. I'm
then
sorry.
And then you can respond to them both. Sorry, go ahead, Frank.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your talk, but I had an appointment. I worry that the biggest audience in the Democratic Party for your message is not these centrists, but basically the progressive left. I would say the most dominant Democratic politician is AOC, right? She wears a dress that says tax the rich. She's
right
in the face, and she's not all that popular, with the general public. But many progressives that would eat up what you're saying, don't make compromises. Our problem is we haven't pushed our message strongly enough. If we just push harder on it, we'll get there.
Frank, okay, so let me start with that one. So AOC is a cult figure. She has organized, she's raised more money, she's organized more enthusiasm for the party than anybody else. The reason she's not popular in general in public opinion survey polls is either people don't know her or she's regarded as this crazy loony socialist, right? Which she is.
She's dominant.
She is, absolutely. What I'm saying is that that's how she's made her name. That's why we're talking about her right now. She's really big time. And the fact that she's not as popular, that's because of her economic policies and her ultra wokeness, because she's so far to the left. I could see but she is a good example of a high dominance politician. You put that in somebody who's not as far to the left as she is on culture and the economy, and I think you'd actually get really good results. And I think we're seeing that in somebody like Gallego and company. Bernie Sanders is another high dominance politician. But here's the thing about AOC and Bernie Sanders: is a high dominance politician doesn't just ignore the polls and pursue their own principles. A high dominance politician doesn't just like talk trash to the opposition. A high dominance politician also has a redemptive story. They cast themselves and their followers as the doers of great deeds, things that have already, they say, look at what we've done. Look at the great things we've done. And that's just a harbinger of the future. Eugene Debs talked about this as well, like Bernie's here, but Bernie never does it. All Bernie does is shake his finger at you and talk about the 1% and talk about how damn miserable capitalism has made you. He does not have the MLK redemptive story about our inevitable triumph with the help of Providence and hardworking, activists that's going to lead to a better day. Neither does AOC. It's all complain, but they don't talk about this great future that the country has. What's more, they do not have national stories. They are so allergic to nationalism that they don't have what I'm calling this democratic national story. And I'll get back to this other question, your colleague's prior question. Somebody has to write this down, because a lot of people now are kind of suggesting the Democrats need to push back. Jill Lepore has a lot of stuff on this. I'm just trying to write it down. I mean, take the United States. What's our democratic national story, which the Republicans have completely violated? What are the two most sacred things about America? What are our sacred traditions that make us American? Uniquely American, not uniquely American. Democracy, we were founded for the purposes of self-government, and our demographic dynamism, which is to say that we're a nation of immigrants. People come from all over the world, they're received in, okay? You could add a third one, which is the tradition, the more recent tradition of vigorous support for our allies in the world and obviously loyalty to the country. On all three of these things, the Republicans have committed treason. They're trying to destroy democracy. They're nativists, which is the ultimate anti-American, un-American thing to be, and they're trying to sell us out to Vladimir Putin, right? The Democrats need to tell that story. The true American story, which is say our story, to combat their story, is a nation of people that is literally the world, striving and succeeding and going through even dark nights of the soul, but still succeeding. And Reagan talked most eloquently about immigration, but he didn't talk about it as an act of compassion for poor people from developing countries, which is the way the Democrats talk about it. He talked about it as the essential building block in American greatness. We need to go back to a speech he gave right the day before he left office. 5 minutes, brilliant. We need to repeat that speech. He always defended these positions in terms of national greatness. On democracy, the Republicans have obviously completely blown it on there. Why don't we make a big deal of that? They're traitors. They're traitors to these two sacred pillars of Americanism, right? Plus they don't even support our own country and our allies in our battle with our greatest sworn enemy in the world. That national story, I think you can write it on a page or two. And I invite everybody to try to give that a shot, because we need that story. We need to tell it all the time and wrap our every progressive cause in that story. And if we do so, it's going to be a lot more attractive than the usual kind of particularist, charity-based way that we approach helping the folks that we actually want to help. Okay.
On that note, let's go tell stories about American inclusion and greatness. Thank you very much. All right, and we come back in April with Roxana show. All right.